Hi, my name is Phil, and I'm building a Chesapeake Light Craft Teardrop Camper. The camper is built out of marine-grade plywood panels that get stitched together and stitched into a cradle with copper wire to give them their curve, and then tacked together with dabs of CA glue so the stitches can be removed. The panels are then glued together with epoxy and fiberglass. Where the panels meet at a sharp enough angle, the curve is softened by putting in fillets of epoxy thickened with wood flour. This allows fiberglass tape to be laid into the corner. This video is about installing panels 1 through 4. To start at the end, here's what the panels look like inside the camper after the floor has been completed. While you are working on these long seams, you will need to take advantage of the fact that you can tip the cradle up and also on its side. We used scrap 2x4s and some quick clamps to prop the cradle up at a convenient angle. Before applying any epoxy or fiberglass, I put some mylar in between the panels and the cradle where I thought the cradle might otherwise get glued to the panels, such as at the top of the join of the two number 1 panels. The first joint does not get any thickened epoxy since it's flat enough that the fiberglass tape can lay flat against it. The joint gets wetted with epoxy, and fiberglass tape is then laid along the joint and wetted out similarly to doing the puzzle joints. Be careful not to lean against the panels during this long reach. If you have started epoxying and you crack the CA glue that is tacking the panels together, at this point, there's little you can do to keep the joints aligned while the epoxy cures. The joints between panels 1 and 2 get wetted out like the first joint, but then you add fillets. About fillets. For these particular fillets, the build manual says to use a filleting tool with a 3/4 inch radius, which translates to a 1.5 inch diameter. However, if you buy the filleting toolkit from CLC, they don't provide a tool with a 3/4 inch radius. The closest you get is a 1 inch radius or a 2 inch diameter, although they do include a butter knife shaped tool with a much larger radius. I think the important thing to do here is not get nitpicky about following the letter of the handbook in terms of radius, diameter, or whatever with the fillets. Just try to copy what's in the pictures. I'm pretty sure there are some typos in the manual since on one page they refer to a filleting tool with a 3/8 inch radius, and then a couple of pages later tell you to use the same 3/8 inch diameter tool. A 3/8 inch diameter tool is tiny, by the way. That's a little smaller than the diameter of the cap on a Bic pen. The smallest diameter tool they provide has a 1/2 inch diameter, and I suspect they actually mean to use a tool with a 3/4 inch diameter. Anyway, as I said, you should try to match the fillets in the pictures in the build handbook. In these particular fillets, the radius of the curve is only important because you need to get the fiberglass cloth to lay flat in a corner. We spent quite a bit of time getting the fillets nicely smoothed out, but where you are laying fiberglass over a fillet, CLC has you laying in the fiberglass before the fillet hardens, which means you end up squishing the fillet a bit lumpy no matter how careful you are. Don't trouble yourself too much on these if you are going to insulate the inside of the cabin. They'll be covered up. The ones that are more visible are the fillets in the galley, and they don't get fiberglassed. The galley is where you need to take care and make a showpiece, but that's another video. It helps if you have 2 people working on these fillets, one to mix epoxy while the other lays a bead along the corner seam, and to trade off doing the fillets. Even if there are 2 of you, don't mix as much epoxy as CLC recommends for the first fillets. You'll probably end up with a hot bag of rock-hard epoxy as it cooks off too quickly to use. Start small, about half of the 12 ounces the build manual says, and then work up in volume if you like. but at some point that stuff will begin to cook, and the hotter it gets, the faster it hardens. If you make too much epoxy in one batch, it can get so hot it will boil. As with the first joint, the number 2 panel joints get a layer of fiberglass tape wetted out. Before you lay out the tape, take the time to clean up the tracks of thickened epoxy that were left behind on either side of the filleting tool. Then you need to roll out the tape and try to get it to lay smoothly across the joint. There will be wrinkles in spots. You will need to decide later if those areas need to be fixed. You won't get done before your epoxy hardens if you spend too much time fiddling with the epoxy tape. Get it laid out and smoothed, then wet it out with unthickened epoxy. If it's not smooth, remember that you can sand it later when you epoxy the interior. If it's really bad, I would suggest you go ahead and sand it smooth well into the fiberglass and then add another layer of fiberglass tape. And that would only be if you don't plan to add the interior insulation. Panels 3 and 4 pretty much go the same way. They get stitched in, tacked with CA glue, then epoxied with fiberglass tape. I found that when the edges were aligned perfectly and the corner met perfectly at the front of the camper, the back corners were off by, I don't know, maybe a 1/16th to an 1/8. That's really very good. I eventually decided that the front corner probably mattered more, or maybe I was just not getting how the back fits together around the galley flat. Later I'll show you what I mean. In any case, it's far better than I could expect if I lofted from a drawing or even traced from full-size drawings. I found I needed to drill a couple of holes and add a stitch in a couple of places to get the panels to align. One of the quirks I've noticed in the panels from Chesapeake is that there are some holes that have been drilled but cannot be used. For example, in the corner between panels 2 and 3. The holes there do not line up and they seem to be blocked by the cradle. I drilled another hole in panel 2 to line the stitch up better, and then put in a steel stitch because the copper ones broke more than once trying to pull the panels together perfectly. I was a little worried while I was pulling the panels together. Panels 2 and 3 pulled away from the cradle at the front corner, but that turned out to be fine. At the other end of panels 2 and 3, I again added a couple of holes for a stitch to pull them together. Don't bother worrying about that as long as the edges of the panels line up. Lining up the edges is the most important thing you can do to make the camper take its shape and to avoid sanding through the ply and into the glue layer. Anyway, panels 3 and 4 get stitched and tacked and then glued as with the other panels, and the only important difference here is that tape you see on the joint between panel 2 and 3. That tape marks the end of the fillet and the fiberglass. Later, the joint gets cut from the blue tape to the rear of the camper when you cut out the lid for the galley. We put in blue tape, wet out the joint, filleted and taped and wet out the fiberglass tape as with the other joints, except that we were careful to cut the fiberglass so it stopped at the blue tape. On this curve, we found the fiberglass tape fought with us and ended up with wrinkles that we could not smooth away, so we cut darts into the cloth so it could lay flat. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about building this camper. We're having a blast building it. And as always, don't forget to like and share. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and ring the bell so you get notified when I post a new video.